Hello and welcome to the lecture on self and others. This is a follow-up to the previous lecture that we did that pertained to an understanding of personhood, how it was distinct from the biological terms life and also human. So what we're going to try to do here a little bit is just flesh out maybe the origins of the understanding of personhood and conflate it somewhat, unfortunately, with the idea of personality. And we'll look at some different thinkers and then put these into qualitative and quantitative categories. Now, the idea here isn't simply that they're all in the same state of ethical evaluation and it's simply up to you to choose. The idea is that you have to be an intentional person, so the idea that you want to be both ethically and intellectually consistent with your qualifications of personhood as you apply it, particularly here in this course, medical ethics. So with that in mind, this I and thou, I take a phrase from Martin Buber, the Jewish philosopher's understanding, that when we objectify others, it's more of an I and it situation. But when we see the other person as another I, or maybe an extension of ourselves, then this becomes the basis of dignity. I did this basically so that we can understand, at least begin to understand, that this idea of person comes from the ancient Greek use of the word persona, which we can almost understand now, of wearing different masks, say during a theatrical performance. So it was this idea that you have an identity or a persona depending on which mask you use, and this particular instance of persona then was caught up by the early Christians when they started to understand issues revolving around the Trinity, how you can have, say, three persons within one God, which they were termed hypostasis. In between those, you have even the Roman notion of personhood being that entity or individuals that are bestowed with rights and therefore duties. And today we have an extension of that with corporate personhood, so something that's an entity that can be held accountable. So it begins, with the idea of persona, moves on to the Roman understanding of entity with rights and duties to the 4th century arguments that were revolving around this idea of a Trinitarian God that could be one and also be three. So the one is the ousia and the three is the hypostasis. Then you have what we would call this Aristotelian I. Now, in other words, it may seem a little odd, but the minute that we say I will be back or I like this, it's trying to get at what exactly is constituted by that I. Prior to this, you had Boethius, the medieval theologian and philosopher, who said the one thing that distinguishes an individual from a human from, say, other animals is that we are rational. So you have this idea of a rational animal being a distinction of person. Now, we know that other animals, although perhaps obviously not the same level of reasoning as humans, they do seem to have some rationality. So it's a very basic understanding. But today we start to look at, when we say again the Aristotelian I, that I think, I am, I choose, that this I is connected and dependent on others. So we always say it in conjunction or, in relation to others. So there is that concept of the I and the thou, where we can try to understand this individual who we are. Now, if all of this seems a little vague and a little abstract, I'll soon try to put a good face on all of it here. But one of the points that I want to make, over the material that we did in the last class is that, remember, life and human are biological terms, and person is a little distinct here. So in bioethics, if you want to just have some general applications of this, think about artificial intelligence. How might that play out when we understand, say, an android or robotic might take on an issue of personhood? Why would we even think that? Or perhaps even in transhumanism, like the nanobiotechnical enhancements and such. Like if we were able to get it to the point where because of something that can enhance the human person, now they can run 50 miles an hour, or they can jump 30 feet over a wall or such. We would say those things are beyond the human nature. Well, anytime you talk about transhumanism like that, or even when does something become human, it has to start with what is it in the beginning. So you can't trans something from one thing to another unless it is something to begin with. So these are not just some, abstract philosophical studies. They do have direct applications, as we will see and move on in this course. But we're going to move on our argument a little bit, and even once we get past being of human in life, we're going to keep in the back of our minds that those are quantitative statements. In other words, they can be measured, as opposed to persons, which we're going to say is more qualitative. Now, that doesn't mean that it's just a quality that you choose, but it will be that, or it'll be one that you ascribe to all human lives. You cannot conceive of a human life that is not a person, or if there are some human lives that are not persons, then it'll be some quality that you envision or at least describe from that. So human in life, if we leave those in the biological domain, we're going to find them to be based on inductive reasoning and very empirical in the way that we come to some sort of consensus on it, as opposed to the personhood or personality. This is much more rational and deductive. So I'm still trying to push us to make sure that we understand that this is where we're arguing. We will talk in terms of human dignity, but again, to be clear, we're talking about dignity of humans that we consider persons. If the human was considered to be a non-person, we would not ascribe dignity towards that. So as we move on, just keeping that in the back of our minds, please. Okay. Now, what I want to do is offer you some comparative notions of personhood, and these are going to be what I would say very cursory. I'm not going to go deep. This is not a philosophy course. If you study psychology, some of these things are individuals, thinkers, might sound familiar to you. So we're going to try to move a little bit beyond the idea that it's some monolithic understanding that either you have non-person humans or that you have all humans being persons. The concept of a soul is not something that is strictly a theistic notion. So, in the ancient Greek world, Aristotle understood soul, which the Greek word for it is anima, animates the individual. So all living things have a soul. Animals comes from the base of the anima, the spirit or the soul that animates that form. So the form is not the material body that we see, but it's the thing that, the essence that underlies it. So Aristotle would say that, the form would be then obviously something that the body takes on. Now, if you can remember or have ever read or studied Plato's theory of the forms as it's played out in his allegory of the cave, the reality, the true forms, not just the shadows that we see, but the real forms were outside the cave. Aristotle understood that this form is the soul of the human person. In ancient Israel, they started this tripartite understanding of the human person, where you'd have the body, so like we would call it, known as the basar, you'd have the soul and the nefesh, and there's a third part called the ruah, almost like the spirit that informs or is like breath of God that enters this individual. So this would be the human person from Judaism's point of view. Now, obviously not just in the Catholic understanding, but we have what we call an incarnate being. So it's not the soul within the body. It's not that I am only inside and this body is a shell. It's that this is a corporate you can say union of both body and soul. So anywhere that you have a human being with a soul, which we don't know of human beings without souls, therefore that will qualify them as persons. Now, we can go on and talk more about this. Augustine only ever saw any self in relation to God. So in the same way that there's always an I and a thou, with Augustine there's always an I and a thou, but the thou is always God. So this idea of soul and body made by God, where there's this inner searching that we come to know God and therefore ourselves, would be an Augustinian notion. As an analogy, think just like when there's a relation of the flame to light. You can never have a flame without the light, nor a light without the flame. So too, the soul being the flame would give light to the body. And this soul, from a theological standpoint, would consist of memory and intelligence and the will. But these are not separate aspects of the self. They're together that we would say creates the essence of humanness, or here we're saying person. Now, in the 18th century, you have John Locke. Now, he understood that the body changes, but identical bodies are not really always thought to be the same person. So, for Locke, let's say the person is the same if they share the same thoughts and actions. But they also have to maintain the same particular memory connections. So for him, the term person is a forensic term. In other words, it's spoken, it's almost declared. And the person has to be capable of law and happiness and misery. And it's extended to the past by consciousness. So there's this stream of consciousness that the individual has maintained. So he held it as principle that he would call transitivity. It manifests itself in the notion of what really is today in modern personality theory often referred to as a psychological continuity. The modern notion is derived from that principle. So let's talk about persons A, B, and C. For example, person B has these conscious memories of an event that occurred prior when they used to be person A. And person C has conscious memories of the event when they were person B. So therefore, C has some psychological continuity with the person A. So think of how it goes from A to B to C, and then C is connected back to A. All right, that's his understanding and the initial workings out for him of our idea of personhood, or we'll say personality theory here. Now this is just a scene of a cobbler and a prince. So this works from an individual known as Bernard Williams. Roughly, let's say he passed away just in 2003. He developed these thought experiments, like in other words, he wanted to test the implications of memory being tied to personality identity, as in John Locke had brought up. And what he did is he determined through various scenarios of anticipation of torture that it wasn't only memories past and present, but future concerns. Let me just give a little example. So for instance, let's say that before that somebody comes and says that we will erase all your memories. And then after all those memories are erased, it's going to be one of two bodies that you can choose to start your new continuity from. One body we will award $100,000 to, and the other body we will torture. Now, you're not going to have any of the memories of us telling you this, so which would you choose? Now, that seems like an odd thought experiment, but Bernard Williams is trying to bring up the point that it's not just this continuity of the past. There's some future concerns here that we might take into account. And it also doesn't just put us inside the body, does it? It makes a real connection between the body, because we might fear being tortured if we wind up in that body, or we might be delighted that we have some sort of reward if we're in the other body. So if you had to choose which consciousness would you allow that body to accept as yours, he's starting to make the point that, these future concerns, and it's not just continuity, are also important. So this is maybe how we could even say how memories are tied into emotions. Going back to the prince and the cobbler, we could almost think of a Freaky Friday scenario, where if we were going to take the consciousness out of the prince and put it into the cobbler, and the consciousness of the cobbler and put it into the prince, which one is now called the prince? So in Freaky Friday, the mom and the daughter, we saw the mom inside the daughter's body, and we recognize that as the mother. So that's almost a little bit, John Lockean, and Bernard Williams is trying to see if that's really how this works. Now, Derek Parfit, he introduced the concept of the non-self, and that, in other words, in asking, what makes it true that some persons in the future will be me, like, this continuity, like if I'm person A and I was person, if I'm person B and I was person A, in what way will I be person C? He posited, I shouldn't be really worried. It's almost egotistical to be worried about some future individual. He said, this only makes concerns for future occurrences. Really, he thinks they're superfluous. In other words, don't worry about them. Rather than have some concern for identical continuity, like what survives me in personal identity, he tried to argue that's not important, but only that the future self, or selves, right, because you can almost think of like a branch theory here, is more or less the original self. So there's always a matters of a degree, and there's like this stream of self that branches off, so that, quite frankly, he would say some of A does become B, not all, and some of B becomes C, but not all. So therefore, if we're going to say what is the relationship between C and A, it's not like Locke, where you have the memories and connections, and it's not like just Williams, where, well, how did the future concerns work in here? But it's that there's some of there. So some of my future self has remained from my past self. Okay. A little bit different here. Maria Schechtman, a living philosopher, she had this notion that memory, though it's important, it's not the crucial thing for personal identity. Now, before you start thinking these are just all, like scattered thought experiments, think in terms of what we consider, Grandpop or Uncle John when they're in a comatose state and we start to say they're not there, or somebody who has a very severe brain injury, or maybe somebody who has an accident and because of how it affected their brain, they're an entirely different person now. See how we even use words like that? Different person. Is that more like Parfit said, where it's a matter of degrees? So all of this really is notions of personhood that we have to start considering so that we can be intentional with how we ascribe personhood so that we're not all over the board and just doing what we think is right in terms of abortion or euthanasia, but something different in artificial intelligence and different in coma, or a person that's in a permanent vegetative state, something like that. Okay, let me go back to Mary Schechtman. So it's not the living memories. It's the identical with consciousness. She thought was simply being overemphasized. In other words, she says some conscious memories are not really part of our identity, right? I mean, there are things that we remember, but they're not central to who we are. And then she said we also underemphasize it when we were unconscious of it. In other words, there are things that are unconscious we have never worked out, but those things are still pretty important to us, at least as far as what we would call the self. So she said, the self is really characterized, there's characterizations that we envelop into a narrative. So we almost begin to tell a story for us. So the answer to who am I is answered in terms of a characterization that's been formed persistently over a span of time. We almost build these things out. It's not identical to psychological continuity here, because these characterizations can be formed, anew, I should say. But it's also not numerically one, right? We wouldn't say we're the same person or that we have that psychological continuity like with Locke, where we have the same memories. So she's offering a different notion of personhood. Now, Daniel Dennett, a living atheist philosopher who wrote a good text on consciousness, something that, if you're interested, it's worth reading. He came up with these 6, I guess we can call them conditions or criteria or themes that are necessary. Well, I'll talk more about what he means by necessary for a living human person. For instance, the first one is rational. Now, that's easy to accept. That goes right back to Boethius. We're rational beings. But intentional. So, we have particular desires and hopes and fears and loves and stuff like that. So there are things that we work out in our lives that, quite frankly, we do so with standard intent. And then he says about stance. What he means by that is we have some stance on this idea of personhood. We are the creature who knows that we are. That type of thing. If that sounds odd to you, we'd have to ask, does a giraffe know they're a giraffe? Well, we're human persons, so a human person would know, any human being who knows they're a person would therefore be a person. So he says these first 3 things, they're necessary for the conditions of personhood, but they're not sufficient because we would share these with animals. I mean, it's likely that some higher primates do understand that they are, different than the rest of the world. And they, too, have, drives that push them towards pleasure and away from fear, maybe not just instinctual, and they show some form of ration. So, these are intentional systems, again, where you're holding beliefs, desires, hopes, fears, and all those things. And we can imagine dogs and horses and chimpanzees particularly holding those. But he says, now beyond those things, there are other conditions. One is reciprocity. In other words, whatever that stance is, you can reciprocate it to others. So sometimes it's colloquially said, though I think it's probably not accurate, but it's fine for now, is that not only do you know that you're persons, but you realize others are persons too, and they have a particular stance in relation to you. So it's a reciprocity of this notion of personhood back and forth. Verbal communication. Now, there are other animals, right, that this would not exclude. So up to this point, we are talking about what makes a living human, a person, but maybe not exclusively so. But with the final thing, he does think that this adds something different, this consciousness. This is that self-awareness, right, where not only do we comprehend ourselves distinct from the world, but we know that we know. We know that we know that we could know. In other words, this may not develop until maybe 5 or 6 months of age post-uterine. So certain philosophers like Peter Singer from Princeton University, as a bioethicist, would see that, lack of personhood that belongs, according to his schema, to the unborn would continue up until 5 or 6 months of age. So he would not consider that murder, because although you are ending a human life, you're not ending a human person. Now, if that's like a knee-jerk reaction for you, understand he's being very ethically and, how do you want to say, intellectually consistent. Because where we say that personhood begins extrauterine, outside of the womb, you're not going to find philosophers that really sense that. So does personhood begin a viability? This is where we have to make these determinations. And that's all in the beginning phase. And when is it lost? Is it lost when a person loses consciousness? Because if that's an element of it and you lose consciousness, then do you therefore, are you deprived of your sense of personhood? This is the thing to consider. And again, I'm not saying all these are right. What I'm saying is that you have to work through these things and not just have some default position. So Roger Scruton, now what he held was the idea of the stable nature of a human being living in terms of personhood. So he also said there is no person outside of a relation to the surrounding world. In other words, we're always in union with other people. We're never in our own. So in short, what many of these theories I spoke about here, personhood is inherently relational. So that would be something that was added to Daniel Dennett's. Scruton said, that's missing. It's just incomplete without that. He also goes on to say that we have to be very careful that we aren't a reductionist. The human person is not a sum of their genetics, nor are they just some of their material aspects. Now, Daniel Dennett, as an atheist, would hold to this reductionist, well, from our Roman Catholic point of view, a reductionist understanding of the human person, because they're reducing them down to the material aspects. So, we can look at firing synapses and, digitally organized, processes and such of the human person, but he'd say be very careful that those things don't give a complete picture of the human person. The self really arises from an interrelation that has to do with beliefs and freedoms, and the knowledge that, I am I and you are you. So that might be a little bit close to the reciprocity of Daniel Dennett, but I think a little bit more than just the way Dennett saw it. And I'm not going to explain it here, but it's interesting. If you've ever heard or studied the philosophy of Ubuntu, right? Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, it's this understanding of relationality that's removed from the concept of personhood, and that becomes the root cause of evil, right? So this autonomous person. So that's not the same thing I'm saying here. It's just a little bit of a side note, interesting, because according to Ubuntu, you could lose this personhood. But there's always this becoming, which develops as an ethos, as the unfolding person. Okay, so all I'm trying to get at here is that these are just 6 of, many, many, many variances and nuances of personhood. They're not all correct. They couldn't be. There's some conflicting things here. There's some overlap. But have you thought about these? To what degree do you find yourself aligning with one of these? And when you do, what are the repercussions? Like, how does it play out to be intellectually and ethically consistent as we apply our medical ethics? So when we do these case studies and such, we might harken back to this and say, do you think that's more like Locke, or do you think it's more like Dennett? Or do you think it's more like Scruton? That type of thing. All right? Now, 2 slides in this. This will be a quick one. Dignity is either going to be assigned based on some value that's perceived or real, or it's simply found and discovered and then we recognize it. Most of the issues that we have with having good, meaningful arguments, and by arguments I mean rational arguments, not quarreling, is that we mix up an understanding of natural and social kinds. So it doesn't matter if we're talking about race, or if we're talking about sex and gender, if we're talking about ethnicity. To what point are they natural and we just found them, or they're social and they've been constructed? We don't really start at the beginning with these discussions. We start with already arguing about how they're applied. And that becomes an issue. But now we're going to try to look at this solely in regards to personhood. We're going to have to ask the question, is personhood something natural and discovered, or is it a social kind that we simply construct? So anything that's a natural kind, it's going to reflect the natural order of the world. In other words, if we talk about the periodic elements and we talk about lithium, lithium has been discovered, but it is what it is. We can call it a different name, but we can't call something else lithium. lithium is what it is. We can't start saying, well, mercury's kind of like that, so if we put mercury and lithium together, we can still call it lithium. We can't, because there's a natural demarcation to make something lithium and makes it not mercury. That's a little bit distinct. Natural kinds here, we're going to see, tend towards what we would call, well, I'll come back to that. Let me just at least compare that to the social kinds. These things, in contrast, reflect interest in actions. So if somebody says that race is not essential, it's a construct, then you're going to start asking questions about, well, whose interest does it serve to divide race like this? And then, what are the actions that come from this? Anything that's going to be natural, we will say, is essential. So it has a nature and a substance that cannot be changed, like lithium. We can't change the nature of lithium. We can call it by a different name, but it doesn't matter. Something else doesn't become lithium. So all we do is we discover that. With things that are social kinds, they're a construct, but yet they are still very real. So we wouldn't mock somebody who simply says that their idea of personhood is a construct and therefore it's not real. We would criticize their notion of personhood based on various factors, like the six different versions that I gave you. But let's just say in terms of race, if somebody were going to say race is a construct, that doesn't make racism not real. Okay, I don't want you to think that we're talking about fiction here just because sometimes when you hear construct, you hear made up, and then everything that flows from it is fiction. That's not the case here whatsoever. But in our terms, what we want to know is personhood forensic? In other words, it's just something that's spoken, it's a social kind, or is it discovered because it's a natural kind? If we say it's forensic, and it's simply something that's social and constructed, we're going to have to say who decides. In other words, if we were to say that lithium could be mercury, who makes these types of decisions? If we say that there are human beings who are persons, and there are human beings who are not persons, well then who will make that decision? Now the problem here is that it'll never be a group deciding for somebody that they don't include themselves in, all right? So if somebody says, well, I believe these are the criteria for personhoods, the personhood of a human life, you can be sure of one thing: they're going to be in the group that's personhood. So here, all you have to do is start asking yourself, can you envision human lives that aren't persons? And if you could, when do they become persons? And then, quite frankly, who decides that? That's part of the issue. A lot of, when you say dystopic literature, is based on that. If it's discovered, then we're going to have to say, how is that nature determined? So if we're going to say there is a human nature and it's stable, we're going to have to give the qualities for that and how we determine it. And then be consistent. So whatever dignity is ascribed to the unborn, that dignity cannot be derided or lost in any way, no matter what they do. In other words, it could be a single mother who pays no attention to her children and winds up, getting steeped into drugs and becomes addicted. That dignity is never gone. None of those factors ever had anything to do with granting their personhood, so it can never be brought away from their personhood. So all I'm trying to get at with all of this is to tell you that you have to be intentional when you're trying to determine this. From a Roman Catholic point of view, here at a Franciscan university, we could say that dignity is pinned to personhood, but we're not going to see any human life that is not a person. So this is dignity from conception until death. And it matters little what the person does. It doesn't matter how many bad decisions an individual has made. It doesn't matter if they got pregnant before they were married. It doesn't matter if they had an abortion and regret it. Nothing reduces the dignity of the individual ever. That's a little bit dogmatic in the sense that it is at least founded on divine revelation, but it is not irrational. It just simply didn't start from reason alone. But it has other factors there that we can at least say helps build in this understanding of the human person and the dignity that's ascribed to that. So the concept of personhood, as I close, is directly tied to the dignity of the living human. And this is the foundation of ethics, and it's going to have implications throughout the sphere of medical ethics that we study.